In certain key respects, Derek Parfit was the contemporary philosopher closest to the Buddha in his viewpoints. Derek Parfit passed away in 2017. In this video, we'll discuss his views and Buddhism. What we'll do is begin with a short description of his life for those of you who don't know about him. Then we'll discuss certain respects in which Derek Parfit's views were aligned with those of Buddhism and the Buddha. Then afterwards, we'll look at some differences between Derek Parfit's views and those of Buddhism. And last, to some lessons that we may learn from his approach to philosophy in general. So I'll begin with a short sort of overview of Derek Parfit's life. And this has been helped enormously by a recent biography. I have a copy of it right here. I'll leave a link to the biography and a lot of other material down in the notes if you want to learn more about him. So he was born in 1942 in China, actually, which is rather interesting, to parents who were missionaries. And they were missionaries, but missionaries who were sort of beginning to give up the whole idea of being missionaries. They'd sort of lost interest in that kind of work by the time they left China. He eventually moved to the United States, then back to England, where he entered Eton, which is basically a British high school, very important, very famous school, and then after that into Oxford University in England. And he remained, well, in one way or another, essentially he remained at Oxford for his entire life. And much of the book describes his sort of strange, privileged, and rarefied life at Eton and at Oxford, and as a professor of philosophy. He began life as a kind of a prodigy with enormous abilities at a range of different interests. Certainly somebody who was a polymath in many ways, except for mathematics, actually, which he was not so interested in, but for everything else, he was enormously good at it. However, in later life, he became more and more and more focused on philosophy in particular, and in the last decades really lived a more or less monkish existence, a lay monkish existence, but nevertheless a monkish existence as a professor. His early published work was on personal identity and ethics. Later on in life, he focused pretty exclusively on ethics, and he became one of the most respected philosophers of recent decades. Perhaps the most respected living ethical or ethicist philosopher nowadays is a man named Peter Singer. And what Peter Singer had to say about Derek Parfit is that he was the philosopher of whom, of all those I have encountered, the label genius best fits. And so I think this particular view gives a general flavor of the respect with which Derek Parfit's views were held within academic philosophy in general. Now, second, I want to get into some of his similarities with the Buddha. I've already mentioned his somewhat monkish lifestyle. I wouldn't take that too far, of course. He was a layperson. However, in many respects, the life that he lived in his last decades were not unlike that of a monastic, in the sense of his exclusive, really exclusive focus on philosophy, on the life of the mind and the life of philosophical investigation. However, when it comes to views, which is really the point at which Derek Parfit's philosophy matched that of the Buddha, his viewpoints on personal identity were really the most important, I think, in this regard. Now, to be clear, he was far from the only philosopher with similar kinds of views on personal identity. I'll leave a link down in the notes to a video with contemporary philosopher Dan Dennett, who is arguing more or less along the same lines. And of course, we can go back to the Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, who held to very similar kinds of views. However, of all of these philosophers, Derek Parfit was the one who most explicitly linked his viewpoints to those of the Buddha in what is perhaps his most famous and brilliant book, Reasons and Persons. Again, I'll leave a link to that book down in the notes. Sometimes, at least when I've looked in past years, it has been sort of on back order. I'm not sure if it's being published anymore. In any event, that's the book to read of his, in my opinion. In this book, he argues that personal identity over time is essentially not what matters. that persons are vague things, not unitary souls. In order to get a flavor of his argument, I'll include a couple of short excerpts in a moment from a video that you can find on YouTube about his views. His argument along these lines is relatively lengthy and complicated, so I'm not going to get into all of it here, but essentially he comes up with a number of really interesting and deep thought experiments that are intended to free us up from our ordinary way of conceiving the self as a kind of a permanent and unitary soul that persists through time. He begins by mentioning that there are several different views about personal identity, that is, about what makes us the same through time. And then he goes on to say,
it's in imagined cases that these different views start disagreeing. I mean, I mentioned one already, a brain transplant. Suppose each half of your brain is successfully transplanted into the empty skull of, let's call them, your identical twin siblings, so that the body is exactly similar. Well, two people would wake up. Each of them has half your brain, seems to remember living your life, is psychologically just like you. What happens to you?
The point that Derek Parfit wants to make in this example is that there's no good answer to this question. The question has an incorrect assumption. The assumption is that, again, that a person is a kind of a unitary soul, sort of like the way we used to think of the atom as something that was indivisible, that persisted indivisibly through time within us. Once we give up that idea that a person or a self is a kind of a unitary thing that is indivisible among other things, that is unchanging, then we begin to see that this kind of thought experiment is obviously a possibility. In the video, Derek Parfit goes on to consider David Hume's comparison of a person to a nation. Just the way a nation is, we might say, made up of a number of people living on a territory, but a nation isn't identical either to the people or to the territory, or even to both the people and the territory together, so too a person is made up of a body and mental aggregates, we might say, but isn't identical to either one or even to both. We can think also of the very famous Buddhist analogy of a self being like a chariot that's made up of parts, but isn't identical to those parts.
Now, I don't think the nation is that territory, and I don't think the nation is that group of people. But the existence of a nation doesn't involve anything over and above a group of people living on a territory. And that's the way I think we should think about person. I'm not just this physical object. I'm not a series of experiences. But there's nothing more to my existence than a series of thoughts and experiences that are closely connected to this body.
Basically, Derek Parfit argues that all that matters to being a person or a self is being a continuous stream of causally connected mental and physical events of a certain type. There's nothing more to being a person or a self. Words like soul or self, therefore, are kinds of manners of speaking about these kinds of streams of events. Derek Parfit calls this the reductionist view of the self, and he says explicitly that the Buddha would have agreed with this view that Derek Parfit, is putting out there. He goes on to say, the contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel once claimed that it is psychologically impossible to believe the reductionist view. Buddha claimed that though this is very hard, it is possible. I find Buddha's claim to be true. Derek Parfit also includes an appendix in the book Reasons and Persons with citations, quotes from the Buddhist book The Questions of King Milinda, as well as Vasubandhu and the Visuddhimagga, many of which were taken from a book by Stephen Collins, contemporary Buddhologist Stephen Collins, from his famous book Selfless Persons. Selfless Persons, that is Stephen Collins' book, was published in 1982, whereas Reasons and Persons came out in 1984, so there's almost certainly a relationship there between these two books. I don't know the specifics of that relationship. If you do or know where it has been talked about, I'd be interested to know. Leave it down in the notes below, because the closeness with which these two books came out leaves no doubt in my mind that there was an influence from Stephen Collins's book to Derek Parfit. Later, according to biographer David Edmonds, a copy of Reasons and Persons made its way actually to a Buddhist monastery, I believe in North India somewhere. And Edmonds goes on to say that Parfit was delighted to discover that Buddhist monks had been heard chanting passages from the book. Another less mentioned similarity between the Buddha and Derek Parfit lies behind the motivation for their efforts. The Buddha was famously quoted as having said that, "I teach only suffering and the cessation of suffering," something that I actually did a video about in the past. Similarly, Derek Parfit in 1963, while he was still a graduate student at Oxford, or undergraduate at Oxford, argued that just one starting point, the aim of all actions should be to reduce suffering. And at the end of his biography of Derek Parfit, David Edmonds goes on to argue that even at the end of his career, Parfit was arguing much the same thing. That is to say that throughout his career, Derek Parfit remained true to this general feeling that the motivation for all efforts should be to reduce suffering. Third, I want to get into some key differences between Derek Parfit's general outlook and that of the Buddhas. In respect of personal identity, in some ways, Derek Parfit's view went even beyond that of the Buddha. That is to say, the Buddha never envisioned persons as splitting apart or merging the way Derek Parfit at least thought was possible. I get into some of this in my other video on the vagueness of persons. I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes. More specifically, of course, Derek Parfit was not a Buddhist. He was a professional academic philosopher who held to his views passionately and intensely. The Buddha famously argued against the idea that we should hold views that were merely hammered out by reason, deduced from investigations following flights of thought. On the other hand, this very thing, this hammering out by reason, was what captivated Derek Parfit most of all, and indeed, I would argue, captivates most, if not all, contemporary academic philosophers. Now, it's true that much of what Derek Parfit argues for is influenced to some degree by experiment and evidence. For example, the discussions about split brain patients and so on is to large degree influenced by brain science, at least to a degree, I should say. Hi folks, future me breaking in here. I was just editing the video and something occurred to me that I had forgotten to mention, which is one significant difference between Derek Parfit's view and the Buddha's, is, you might not be surprised to hear, Derek Parfit does not accept reincarnation, does not believe that there is evidence for it. He actually, in Reasons and Persons, has a very interesting discussion of reincarnation, he calls reincarnation rebirth, where his claim is that if we had evidence for rebirth or reincarnation, that would actually tend to support the view of what he calls the Cartesian ego, or what we might call a permanent, unchanging self. That is to say that the sort of unity that would have been implied, the unity of the self that would be implied by retaining selfhood in a sense over time, that is to say from one lifetime to the next, or retaining memories from past lives, would suggest that therefore memories, personality to an extent perhaps, was retained from lifetime to lifetime, which would at least potentially support the view of a substantial mental self that persisted through time. So that's his view. He doesn't believe that we have evidence for rebirth or reincarnation, and so therefore he leaves that aside. And now back to past self. And Parfit's later work, in particular in his book, in this particular book, and a couple of books after this, on what matters, it's what it's called, are about one of the main obsessions in a lot of Western philosophy, which is about foundationalizing, in particular, foundationalizing ethics. Derek Parfit was very disturbed about the disagreements people had about ethical matters, both within and outside the academy. Many philosophers don't believe that ethics has true foundations in the right sense of that term. Many people believe that it's simply a matter of opinion, that ethics is completely subjectivist. However, Derek Parfit was a staunch believer in the objectivity of ethics, that ethics was real. In that sense, he agreed with the Buddha, who was always very clear that ethics was a real matter, was not simply a matter of opinion. But unlike the Buddha, Derek Parfit believed that if ethics could not be properly foundationalized, if we could not explicitly list and describe the foundational facts that grounded our ethical conclusions, then the only other option was ethical nihilism. The Buddha, on the other hand, was much more of an ethical pragmatist, we might say. The Buddha gave many different potential ways that we could determine what was the better from the worse actions, or what was the more skillful or the less skillful, or what was the right or wrong action in particular circumstances. He never tried to foundationalize it to one true account of right from wrong, but seems to have believed, at least from the suttas, seems to have believed that there were a number of different ways we could approach that problem, and that foundationalizing ethics was not a particular concern of his. Indeed, it seems that for the Buddha, ethical realism was simply obvious, and perhaps that obviousness was bolstered by his belief that he could intuit the workings of karma over time. But that aside, we might wonder to what extent foundationalizing something like ethics really helps to overcome suffering in the longer term. If all of our actions, as Parfit and the Buddha seem to believe, if all of our actions should be directed towards lessening or eliminating suffering, to what extent does foundationalizing ethics help towards that end? It certainly is ego-driven, it certainly is career-driven to do such a thing, in the sense that coming out with a book about how to foundationalize ethics can help your career in philosophy. It might help you get tenure. It might help make other philosophers think more highly of you. But to what degree does it actually help suffering? Indeed, it seems that arguing over such matters as how correctly to foundationalize ethics only increases suffering by increasing argument, dispute, enmity between people. Indeed, Derek Parfit himself seems to have suffered greatly from his disagreements with other philosophers on these matters. And this leads us to our fourth point about what we can learn from Derek Parfit's example. Well, to begin with, Parfit's work is indeed academically brilliant. If you're interested in contemporary philosophy, I would recommend taking a look at his books, in particular Reasons and Persons. It's very dense, so you'll have to put up with that denseness, the denseness of contemporary academic philosophical work. However, I think for those of us interested in that, it does reward reading. However, it's also deep within what the Buddha would have termed the thicket of views. Derek Parfit is very much about views, about analyzing and rationalizing particular viewpoints as against others which are less easily held in his point of view. However, Parfit never gives us a path of practice the way the Buddha does. There's no practical, really, way through Parfit. Parfit is simply a philosopher who teaches you ways of thinking, not so much practices. Further, we might wonder about where this idea of foundationalism really arose in Parfit's example, or indeed in the West in general, that again, I would say has a sort of an obsession in philosophy with foundations. In particular, we can look perhaps to Parfit's parents, to this theological justification for ethical claims that come from, at least originally and long ago in the Western tradition, came from God. The idea being that all of our ethical justifications were essentially justifications based on what God said or did not say. And once God is taken out of the picture, as it is in virtually all of contemporary philosophy and also in the case of Derek Parfit, once God is taken out of the picture, then it seems as though we're left with a kind of a hole. We're left with this kind of ethical nihilism that so disturbed Derek Parfit as a possibility. And so I think this search for ethical foundations is an attempt to essentially substitute some kind of ideas, some kind of sentences, some kind of concepts, substitute those for this God that is no longer there. However, if we begin from a non-theological stance, as, for example, we find in many non-Western sort of philosophical or religious approaches to these matters, then the draw to foundationalism may be less important to us. It may seem less important. And then we may well wonder, as I've said, whether this search for foundations is really what's going to help us overcome suffering, or rather, whether a focused practice, let's say, of calm, of concentration, a practice of deepening our understanding of non-self and our deepening relaxation around identification with and clinging to this improper and incorrect notion of a self, whether these instead will be surer routes towards this eradication of suffering that Derek Parfit and the Buddha both believe was so important. In other words, perhaps we can look to a practice that would help us to understand the Buddha's view more deeply, the way that Derek Parfit says he thought was possible, although difficult. If we can look to that kind of practice, perhaps that's the way to go, instead of attempting to dive into this thicket of views that are around foundationalism of ethics in particular, and which will always end up being controversial. As the Buddha might say, try them both and see what works for you. If you want to hear more about the ethics, the actual ethics of early Buddhism, I did a video on that a while ago, an introductory kind of video about that, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.